Hey guys! Tonight, we're doing one of those stories that history books politely step around, clear their throat about, and then immediately move on from. So if you've had a long day, if the lights are already dim, if your phone is slowly sliding toward your pillow, you're in the right place. Get comfortable. There's no jump scares here. No dramatic twists. Just a long, slow walk through the quiet aftermath of something deeply uncomfortable. Tonight, we're talking about what really happened to witch women after the trials ended. Not during the accusations. Not during the shouting or the sermons or the very theatrical finger-pointing. But after. After the court packed up. After the village decided it was done being afraid. After history, conveniently, lost interest. Because surviving a witch trial didn't mean life went back to normal. It mostly meant life went sideways. Quietly. Permanently. So let's ease into it. When people imagine witch trials, they picture chaos. Fires. Screaming crowds. Angry men in hats. And yes, all of that did happen, far more often than anyone would like to admit. But statistically speaking, a surprising number of accused women were not executed. Some were acquitted. Some had charges dropped. Some survived imprisonment. Some were released because the court got bored, or the harvest needed tending, or the local lord had a new priority. And that's where our story begins. Not with death, but with survival. Which, inconveniently, turned out to be its own punishment. Imagine being told, officially, by a court, that you are probably not a servant of Satan. Not definitely innocent. Just, not guilty enough today. You're handed back your clothes, assuming they still exist. You're escorted out of whatever damp stone room you've been sitting in for weeks or months. And you're told you can go home. Of course you can go home. Why wouldn't you? Except, home doesn't really want you anymore. In early modern Europe, especially places like Germany, Switzerland, Scotland, and parts of France, which accusations didn't come from nowhere. They came from neighbors. From relatives. From people who had borrowed salt and never returned it. From people whose cow got sick and needed someone to blame. And once your name had been said out loud in a courtroom, it didn't matter how the verdict landed. Everyone had already heard it. So a woman returning to her village after a witch trial wasn't greeted with relief. She was greeted with silence. With doors that closed a little faster. With conversations that paused when she walked past. With children being pulled indoors, just in case. Because what if the court got it wrong? And of course, what if they didn't? Many women found that their property had been quietly redistributed while they were gone. A cow sold. A plot of land reassigned. Household goods borrowed indefinitely. After all, no one expected her to come back. And once she did, well, awkward. Legally, she might still own these things. Socially, trying to reclaim them was a great way to remind everyone that you were that woman. The one who had stood accused of consorting with the devil. The one whose name had been whispered during sermons. So most didn't push it. They learned very quickly that survival required smallness. Speak less. Ask for nothing. Stay invisible. And this was especially true for older women. Widows. Healers. Midwives. The exact same women who had been targeted in the first place. Their usefulness had always been informal. Their protection had always been thin. And now, with suspicion cemented into memory, they existed in a strange half-status. Technically free. Functionally untouchable. In some regions, particularly in parts of Germany, records show women who survived trials being formally banned from certain activities. They couldn't testify in court again. They couldn't act as midwives anymore. They couldn't prepare herbal remedies. They couldn't even attend certain church functions without supervision. Because why risk it? So these women lived. But they didn't live fully. And the psychological aftermath, well, history is very quiet about that. Which usually means it was bad. Interrogations during which trials were not gentle. Even when torture wasn't officially permitted, and often it was, questioning involved sleep deprivation, isolation, humiliation, and relentless pressure to confess. Women were told repeatedly that everyone already knew they were guilty. That resistance was proof. That denial was evidence. Then suddenly, one day, it stopped. You're released into a world where everyone remembers what you were accused of, but no one wants to talk about how wrong they might have been. So you carry it. Every day. Some women changed their names. Others moved to nearby towns, hoping distance would do what verdicts could not. But word traveled faster than people. And once you were known as a witch somewhere, you were never quite unknown anywhere else. In England, where executions were somewhat less frequent than on the continent, many acquitted women simply disappeared from records altogether. Which sounds peaceful until you remember that disappearing from records usually means slipping into poverty, illness, or early death without anyone bothering to write it down. It's not that these women suddenly found happiness elsewhere. It's that history stopped watching. And for the few who did try to reassert themselves, who tried to reclaim status or dignity, the response was often swift. New accusations. Renewed suspicion. Another round of concerned neighbors. Because once the label existed, it could always be reused. Now let's gently float over to another uncomfortable corner of this story. Family. Surviving a witch trial didn't just isolate women from their communities. It often destroyed their relationships with their own children. Husbands might distance themselves publicly to avoid suspicion by association. Sons might leave. Daughters might be pressured into early marriages, partly to remove them from the household, partly to prove they were normal. And sometimes, families participated in the accusations in the first place. Because fear makes people practical. There are documented cases where relatives testified against accused women, not out of belief, but out of self-preservation. And once that line was crossed, reconciliation was unlikely. So these women aged alone, quietly, often supported only by other marginal figures. Beggars, widows, people who had already been labeled strange enough that one more rumor wouldn't matter. Which, in a deeply ironic way, recreated the exact conditions that had led to their accusations in the first place. Isolation, poverty, visibility without protection. History, being what it is, then used this pattern as evidence that witchcraft was real. Of course it did. In Scotland, where witch trials were particularly intense, some women who survived were forced to wear identifying clothing or live under observation. Not officially imprisoned. Just watched. Which is a very efficient way to erase someone's sense of self without technically breaking any laws. And for younger women, yes, there were younger women too, the damage was different but no less permanent. Marriage prospects vanished overnight. Reputation was everything, and witchcraft accusations didn't exactly pair well with the phrase, respectable match. So many never married. Never had children. Never had the chance to become anything other than the cautionary tale they'd been turned into. And here's the part history doesn't love to emphasize. Many of these women were innocent by every standard except the one that mattered at the time. They weren't practicing forbidden rituals. They weren't meeting demons in forests. They were poor, or loud, or unmarried, or knowledgeable, or inconvenient. And once the trial ended, society didn't apologize. It just waited for them to fade. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, as witch trials gradually declined, something strange happened. Courts became embarrassed. Records grew vague. Trials were quietly dismissed. Accusations were reframed as superstition. Everyone collectively agreed to pretend this had all been a misunderstanding. Which was great for institutions. Less great for the women who had survived. Because there was no rehabilitation. No reintegration. No acknowledgement of harm. Just silence. And silence, as it turns out, is exhausting. So as we move forward in this story, drifting from region to region, woman to woman, we'll keep encountering the same pattern. Survival followed by erasure. Life without belonging. Freedom without safety. In the next part, we'll start looking at specific women. Real names. Real cases. Women who lived decades after their trials, carrying the long shadow of accusations that never quite let go. For now, just stay comfortable. Let your breathing slow. Let the noise of the day drift off. So let's keep drifting forward. No rush. No sudden turns. In this part, we move away from the abstract idea of survivors, and gently settle into the lives of actual women who lived on after their trials ended. Women whose names still exist in court records, parish notes, or irritated marginal scribbles made by men who clearly wished they'd never had to write about them again. Because surviving a witch trial didn't mean history stopped paying attention. It just started paying attention differently. Let's begin in England, since English courts were very good at paperwork and very bad at empathy. One of the most famous survivors was Elizabeth Sawyer, accused in 1621. She was poor, outspoken, elderly, and very tired of being blamed for everything. Which, as you can imagine, went over beautifully with her neighbors. Elizabeth was eventually acquitted. No execution. No official punishment. Just release. And then nothing. Records show her returning to her village and essentially vanishing into social exile. She lived out her remaining years dependent on charity, barred from any informal healing work she may have once done, and permanently under suspicion. Which is an important theme here. Acquittal did not erase reputation. It froze it. Elizabeth's name continued to appear in church complaints long after her trial. Not because she did anything new, but because once someone had been accused, every misfortune nearby suddenly felt suspicious again. A dead chicken. A bad harvest. A headache. Of course it was her. Because of course it was. And she lived with that until she died. Quietly. Without ceremony. Without apology. Now let's float north, up into Scotland, where things were louder. Scotland's witch trials were infamous for their intensity, but they also produced a surprising number of women who survived long enough to experience what came after. Take Isabel Gaudy. She confessed, extensively, to witchcraft in the 1660s. Her confessions were detailed, imaginative, and very convenient for the authorities. And then, she wasn't executed. Historians still debate why. Maybe she was useful. Maybe the court hesitated. Maybe the paperwork got messy. But Isabel lived. And what happened next is telling. She disappears from the records almost immediately. No marriage. No children. No employment. No burial record. Which usually means one of two things. She died in poverty. Or she lived quietly enough that no one thought she mattered anymore. Either way, society had extracted what it wanted from her, fear, confession, spectacle, and then released her back into obscurity. Another Scottish survivor, Bessie Dunlop, accused in the late 1500s, was imprisoned and interrogated for years. She survived. She was released. And she returned to a community that no longer spoke to her unless absolutely necessary. Court records later note complaints that Bessie was wandering. Which sounds harmless until you remember that wandering women were considered inherently suspicious. So even existing in public space became dangerous. Bessie learned to stay indoors. To keep her head down. To shrink. Which brings us to a very uncomfortable truth. Many survivors adapted by becoming exactly what society already believed them to be, isolated, strange, silent figures on the edge of village life. And then history said, see, we were right. Of course it did. Now let's drift over to Germany, where witch trials were frequent, paperwork was meticulous, and mercy was selective. In German territories, women who survived were often subjected to post-trial restrictions. Not officially punishments. Just precautions. Because that sounds nicer. They might be forbidden from owning property, from practicing trades, from speaking publicly. Some were required to swear public oaths renouncing witchcraft. Repeatedly. Because once apparently wasn't enough. And these oaths were not private affairs. They were public spectacles. Performed in churches or town squares. Designed to remind everyone that this woman had once been accused of something unspeakable. So even innocence was performative. One woman, Katharina Kepler, yes, the mother of the astronomer Johannes Kepler, was accused in 1615. Her son fought relentlessly for her defense. She was eventually acquitted. And yet, Katharina spent the rest of her life under scrutiny. She was old. She was ill. She was exhausted. And she died only months after her release. Historians often note this as a natural death, which is technically true. But stress has a way of speeding things along. Katharina's case is often cited as a success story because she wasn't executed. Which tells you a lot about the standards we're working with. Now, something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, surviving witch trials didn't just affect women socially. It affected them physically. Long imprisonments meant malnutrition, exposure, disease. Many women left jail permanently weakened. Some lost teeth. Some lost mobility. Some lost their hearing. And no one provided medical care afterward. Because why would they? So survivors often became visibly frail. Which reinforced the idea that something was wrong with them. A perfect feedback loop. And this physical decline fed into emotional collapse. Depression. Withdrawal. Paranoia. Which again, society interpreted as evidence. You can see where this is going. Let's take a moment to talk about religion, because religion did not step in afterward to heal anyone. Churches were deeply involved in witch trials. Ministers preached about them. Clergy interrogated suspects. And once a woman survived, the church rarely offered reintegration. Instead, survivors were expected to demonstrate excessive piety. Attend every service. Sit in visible places. Confess constantly. Pray loudly. And if they failed to do this convincingly enough, well, suspicion. Some women overcorrected. They became hyper-religious. Which then made people uncomfortable for a different reason. Because intense devotion, when performed by a woman with a reputation, was never reassuring. It was just unsettling in a new direction. So there was no winning. Now let's gently slide into something quieter, but no less tragic, memory. Communities did not forget witch accusations. They passed them down. Mothers warned children. Neighbors told stories. Names became shorthand for danger. In some villages, women who survived were still referred to as witches decades later. Even after death, graves were avoided. Houses associated with them were shunned. Their names were left out of family histories. And this had a ripple effect. Daughters of accused women struggled to marry. Sons found themselves excluded from guilds. Entire family lines were quietly downgraded. All because one woman had once been accused. Which means witch trials didn't just punish individuals. They punished futures. One of the most haunting aspects of post-trial life is how unremarkable it was. No dramatic revenge arcs. No redemption stories. No grand apologies. Just years of small humiliations. Of being tolerated. Of being watched. History doesn't love that kind of suffering. It's too quiet. Too ordinary. Too uncomfortable. So it often skips it. But these women lived through decades of it. And as witch trials declined, something even stranger happened. Survivors became reminders of an era everyone wanted to forget. They were living evidence that things had gone too far. So they were avoided not just out of fear, but out of embarrassment. Which might be worse. As we ease toward the end of this part, keep one thing in mind. Many of these women outlived the belief system that condemned them. They lived long enough to see skepticism rise. Laws change. Courts hesitate. They lived long enough to know it had all been pointless. And yet nothing was given back. For now, stay relaxed. Let the pace stay slow. History has a way of revealing its damage best when it whispers. Hey guys. Tonight, we're settling into one of those historical topics that people love to dress up with lace, candles, and vaguely poetic language, even though the reality was usually awkward, uncomfortable, and mildly horrifying in a very quiet way. So go ahead and dim the lights. Let your phone rest somewhere near your pillow. Loosen your jaw. You don't need to picture anything too vividly tonight. Because we're talking about what medieval women were forced to do on their wedding night. Not the fairy tale version. Not the oil painting version. But the slow, procedural, very supervised version that history preferred to describe with phrases like custom, duty, and tradition. Which are always comforting words. Until you look closer. Now, before we begin, it's important to say this gently. Medieval weddings were not private affairs. Privacy, as a concept, had not really been invented yet. And romance, while technically possible, was not the priority. Marriage was paperwork. Marriage was alliances. Marriage was land changing hands while everyone pretended it was about love. So the wedding night wasn't a moment. It was an event. And like all medieval events, it involved witnesses. Let's ease into that. In much of medieval Europe, marriage was not considered fully valid until it was consummated. Meaning that the physical act mattered legally, religiously, socially, and everyone needed to be reasonably confident that it had happened. which raised a practical question. How would they know? The answer was involvement. Sometimes minimal. Sometimes very much not. In noble families, especially among royalty, the wedding night often began with a formal procession. The bride would be escorted to the bedchamber by relatives, ladies-in-waiting, priests, and assorted people whose job descriptions were unclear but whose presence was apparently necessary. The groom would follow, occasionally looking like he wanted to escape through a window. The bed itself was blessed, sprinkled with holy water. Prayers were said. Advice was offered. And this advice was rarely subtle. Then the couple was helped into bed. Helped. Because why stop there? Now, before your brain starts filling in details, let's keep things calm. The actual act was usually private. Usually. But everything leading up to it was very much a group activity. Clothing was removed with assistance. Sometimes commentary was provided. Sometimes jokes were made. And then, finally, everyone left. Mostly. But not too far. Because the next step was proof. In many regions, especially in France and parts of England, the bedding would be inspected the next morning. Bloodstains were taken as evidence of consummation. This was considered extremely important, particularly if the bride was young or the marriage politically significant. If there was no blood, explanations were required, which were never fun. Doctors might be summoned. Midwives consulted. Priests reassured everyone that bodies were mysterious and God worked in strange ways. And sometimes, the couple was simply told to try again, with witnesses waiting nearby. Because nothing sets the mood like legal pressure. Now let's float gently toward one of the more infamous customs often mentioned in whispers, the bedding ceremony. This wasn't universal, but it was common enough to be normal. After the wedding feast, guests would escort the couple to the bedroom. Psalms were sung. Teasing occurred. Blessings were given. And then the door was closed. Sometimes locked from the outside. Again, romance was not the goal here. The goal was confirmation. For elite women, especially princesses marrying into foreign courts, this was even more intense. Their bodies were not considered their own. They were diplomatic vessels. Their fertility was state business. So their wedding nights were supervised not because anyone enjoyed it, but because too much depended on the outcome. Which brings us to something that's often overlooked. Consent, as we understand it now, was not part of the conversation. Many brides were teenagers. Some were children by modern standards. And they were expected to perform their role quietly, dutifully, and without complaint. Complaints, incidentally, were considered suspicious. Now let's gently step into the emotional reality of this. Imagine being raised knowing that your wedding night would not belong to you. That it would be watched, evaluated, discussed. That failure would not be private. That success would be documented. This did not encourage confidence, or comfort, or relaxation. which made the entire process more difficult. And history responded to that difficulty by inventing more rules. In some places, if consummation didn't occur on the first night, the marriage could be questioned, annulled, declared invalid. The woman was often blamed. Because of course she was. She might be examined physically, questioned about her behavior, accused of resistance, or worse, of deception. All while being told this was normal. Now let's float over to England for a moment, where medieval marriage law was slightly different but no less intrusive. In England, the Church emphasized mutual consent as the core of marriage. Which sounds progressive until you remember that consent could be verbal, whispered, or implied. And once given, it was permanent. Wedding nights were still subject to scrutiny, especially among the nobility. Queens, in particular, were expected to produce heirs quickly. So their wedding nights were followed by intense observation. Diets were controlled. Movements were noted. Menstrual cycles became public knowledge. Which is deeply relaxing, I'm sure. One English queen, Isabella of Valois, married Richard II at the age of 6. Yes. 6. The marriage was not consummated immediately, for obvious reasons, but the expectation loomed. Everyone knew what was coming. And everyone talked about it. Which meant that from childhood, her body was already a subject of state interest. That was not unusual. Now let's slide gently toward France, where things were both more ceremonial and more theatrical. French royal wedding nights often involved public rituals. The bed was displayed. Courtiers were present. Sometimes the king himself would offer commentary. Because apparently that felt appropriate. Afterward, the couple might be woken early so witnesses could confirm they were still together. Still clothed appropriately. Still alive. And again, proof mattered. In one famous case, King Louis XII's marriage was annulled on the grounds that it had never been consummated. The details were discussed publicly. Doctors testified. Witnesses spoke. His wife's body became a courtroom exhibit without her presence. Which was considerate. Now, before we move on, it's important to say this softly. Not every medieval wedding night was traumatic. Some couples cared for each other. Some found comfort. Some built relationships over time. But the structure surrounding these nights was not designed for intimacy. It was designed for verification. And women bore the weight of that system. Especially women who were married multiple times. Widows remarried. Political pawns moved again and again. Each wedding night was another performance. Another evaluation. Failure compounded. And success did not bring freedom. Now let's drift into something quieter but no less strange, instruction. Brides were often given advice before their wedding night. Sometimes by their mothers. Sometimes by priests. Sometimes by women who had already survived the experience and were trying, gently, to prepare them. This advice was rarely comforting. It emphasized obedience, silence, endurance, patience. It framed discomfort as duty, pain as temporary, submission as virtue. And this advice followed women into marriage, into motherhood, into aging. Because once a woman had performed correctly on her wedding night, she was expected to continue performing correctly forever. Which brings us to an uncomfortable but very real point. For many medieval women, the wedding night was not the beginning of intimacy. It was the beginning of surveillance. And surveillance does not fade easily. As we continue, we'll move into different regions, different classes, different expectations. We'll talk about peasant women, noble women, queens, and girls married far too young to understand what was happening. And we'll keep the pace slow, the tone gentle, the lights low. Because history, when told softly, reveals things it usually hides. Stay relaxed. We have a long night ahead. Hey guys. Tonight, we're easing into one of those topics that history never really meant to talk about out loud. The kind it prefers to hide behind vague phrases, missing records, and polite silence. So if you've already turned the lights down, if your room feels a little quieter than it did a few minutes ago, just settle in. Let your breathing slow. Nothing sudden is coming. No shocks. No twists. Tonight, we're talking about what actually happened to disfigured women in ancient societies. Not heroes. Not monsters. Just women whose bodies didn't fit the expectations of the time, and who had to live entire lives carrying that difference in public. Because in ancient history, your body wasn't just yours. It was a social document. And everyone felt entitled to read it. Now, before we drift too far, let's gently clear something up. Disfigurement in the ancient world didn't only mean dramatic injuries or extreme conditions. It could be scars, burns, birthmarks, limping, missing teeth, uneven limbs, facial asymmetry, illnesses that left visible marks. Anything that stood out in a world that didn't have filters, makeup tutorials, or very good lighting. And in societies that believed the gods communicated through the human body, standing out was risky. Let's start very early, in ancient Mesopotamia, where laws were written in stone, literally, and bodies were taken very seriously. In Babylonian society, physical wholeness was associated with divine favor. If your body was intact, symmetrical, and functioning, that was good. Reassuring. If it wasn't, people started asking questions. Quiet questions. Uneasy questions. Women with visible differences often found themselves pushed into narrow social roles. Marriage, which was already transactional, became more complicated. A woman's appearance was directly tied to her value as a wife. And not in a romantic way. In a legal, economic, contract-heavy way. If a woman was visibly disfigured, she might still be married, but often at a lower status. Or as a second wife. or to an older man, or to someone who needed a caretaker more than a partner. And if she wasn't married at all, well, that was not a comfortable place to be. Unmarried women existed, of course. But they were watched, talked about, assumed to be unlucky, or cursed, or marked by the gods for reasons no one wanted to investigate too closely. Because investigating might lead to responsibility. Now let's drift over to ancient Egypt, which at first glance seems more forgiving. Egyptian art shows a surprising variety of bodies. Scars, age, even some disabilities appear in tomb paintings. Which sounds promising. But art and reality rarely match. Egyptian religion placed enormous importance on physical integrity. The body was meant to be preserved for the afterlife. Whole. Recognizable. Stable. Disfigurement wasn't just a social issue. It was a spiritual problem. For elite women, this meant intense pressure to conceal any visible difference. Cosmetics weren't just aesthetic. They were corrective. Wigs, paint, jewelry, linen wraps. All tools used to present an idealized version of the body. Because an elite woman's appearance reflected on her family, her husband, her gods. If a woman became disfigured later in life, through injury, illness, childbirth complications, she didn't disappear, but her public presence often shrank. Fewer ceremonies. Less visibility. More time inside. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because appearances mattered. And for poorer women, there was less room to hide. Now let's float over to ancient Greece, where things get philosophical. And by philosophical, I mean judgmental, but with better vocabulary. Greek culture placed enormous emphasis on physical perfection, harmony, balance, proportion. Especially for women, whose bodies were seen as symbols of order within the household. A woman who looked wrong disrupted that idea. Disfigured women were rarely mentioned directly in surviving texts, which tells us something important. When history goes quiet, it's usually because someone was being ignored on purpose. But we can infer a lot from how Greek writers talked about bodies in general. Physical difference was often linked to moral weakness, or emotional instability, or divine punishment, which is not ideal. Women with visible scars or deformities were often assumed to be unlucky, or dangerous, or both. They might be avoided socially, excluded from religious roles, considered unsuitable for marriage. And since women's lives were largely confined to domestic spaces already, exclusion didn't require dramatic action. It just meant fewer invitations, less help, more isolation. Quiet isolation. The kind that doesn't make it into epics. Let's drift a little further, into ancient Rome, where practicality ruled, until it didn't. Roman society was surprisingly flexible in some ways. Physical difference wasn't automatically disqualifying. Roman elites valued lineage, wealth, and connections more than beauty alone. But for women, appearance still mattered. Especially in public roles. Especially for elite wives meant to represent their families. A Roman woman with a disfigurement might still marry, but again, the terms shifted. Fewer choices. Less leverage. Less protection. And Roman writers, who loved a good metaphor, frequently used women's bodies as symbols. A scarred woman could represent moral decay. A deformed body could be used as a political insult. Which meant that real women with real bodies became rhetorical tools. And no one asked them how they felt about it. One particularly uncomfortable Roman habit was the fascination with curiosities. People with unusual bodies were sometimes displayed. Not violently. Not loudly. Just shown. As conversation pieces. As entertainment. For men, this could occasionally translate into court positions or patronage. For women, it usually meant being objectified quietly, privately, and without dignity. Now let's ease back and talk about religion, because religion shaped everything. In many ancient societies, disfigurement was interpreted as a sign. Sometimes of divine punishment. Sometimes of divine attention. Sometimes both. Which sounds mystical. But in practice, it meant unpredictability. A woman with a visible difference might be avoided because people feared she carried bad luck. Or she might be sought out for the same reason. Asked for blessings. Or curses. Or advice. Which placed her in a dangerous position. Too helpful, and she's suspicious. Too distant, and she's cold. Too visible, and she's unsettling. There was no stable role. In some cultures, women with certain differences were pushed into religious roles, not because they were honored, but because they were already outside normal social structures. Priestesshoods, temple service, ritual labor. Which sounds prestigious until you remember these roles were often isolating, celibate, and tightly controlled. And leaving them was not always an option. Now let's gently talk about violence, without dwelling on it. Many disfigurements came from domestic accidents, childbirth, labor, or illness. But some came from punishment. Or abuse. Or war. And women who were visibly marked by violence carried that story on their bodies forever. In societies without privacy, scars spoke. But not always accurately. A woman with facial scars might be assumed to have been immoral. Disobedient. Punished for something. Whether that was true or not didn't matter. The assumption stuck. And once again, reputation followed the body. Now let's slow things down even more and talk about aging. In ancient societies, aging itself was a kind of disfigurement. Especially for women. Wrinkles, tooth loss, changes in posture. All of these reduced a woman's perceived value. An older woman with visible physical differences was doubly marginalized. Too old to be useful in expected ways. Too visible to be ignored completely. These women often became caretakers, or healers, or figures on the edge of society. Necessary, but not respected. And this is where we see an uncomfortable overlap. Many of the women later targeted in medieval witch hunts shared these same characteristics. Physical difference, age, isolation. History has a long memory for bodies it doesn't like. Now, let's gently pause and take stock. What actually happened to disfigured women in ancient societies wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was gradual, quiet, structural. They lived. They worked. They aged. But they did so with fewer options, fewer protections, and far more scrutiny than women whose bodies blended in. They were not always mistreated outright. Often, they were simply limited. And limitation is harder to record than violence. As we continue in the next part, we'll drift into specific figures. Women whose names survived. Queens. Priestesses. Noblewomen whose bodies became political problems. Women who were married, displayed, hidden, or reinterpreted to fit narratives that made others more comfortable. For now, just stay relaxed. Let the pace remain slow. History doesn't need to shout to leave an impression. We'll keep moving forward together. All right. Let's keep drifting. Nothing sharp here. Just a slow continuation of bodies, expectations, and people who really wished history would stop staring at them. In this part, we gently move upward on the social ladder. Away from ordinary women, whose lives vanished into silence, and toward elite women, queens, princesses, noblewomen, whose disfigurements were impossible to ignore because their bodies were never fully their own to begin with. Because when an elite woman's body changed, politics noticed. Let's float into the ancient Near East again, where royal women were expected to be symbols. Not people. Symbols. A queen's body represented fertility, divine favor, stability, and continuity. Which meant that any visible imperfection became a state issue. Not a personal one. If a royal woman was born with a physical difference, say, a limp, facial asymmetry, or a visible birthmark, it was often quietly reinterpreted. Court scribes might describe it as a sign from the gods. Priests might spin it as destiny. Not because they believed it, necessarily, but because acknowledging randomness was uncomfortable. Randomness implies no one is in control. And ancient elites did not enjoy that idea. So disfigured royal women were rarely described honestly. Their bodies were filtered through symbolism. A scar became a mark of divine protection. A deformity became a sign of chosen suffering. Which sounds poetic, but also meant no one asked how she felt. And if her condition worsened later in life, through illness or injury, the response was often containment. Less public appearance. Fewer ceremonies. More seclusion. Not punishment. Just management. Because queens were meant to be seen. And if they could not be seen correctly, they were not seen at all. Now let's drift into ancient Greece again, but this time into myth-adjacent reality, where elite women existed in the uncomfortable space between visibility and silence. Greek writers were obsessed with idealized female beauty. They wrote endlessly about perfect proportions, smooth skin, symmetry. Which tells us two things. 1. This ideal was rare. 2. Anyone who didn't fit it stood out. Elite women with physical differences were often married off quickly, sometimes younger than planned, before their bodies changed further or became harder to explain. Marriage acted as containment. A woman inside a household was easier to control than one in public view. And if she couldn't marry well, she might not marry at all. Which, for elite women, was deeply destabilizing. Marriage wasn't optional. It was the mechanism through which alliances functioned. A disfigured daughter complicated negotiations. So families adapted. They lowered expectations. They offered larger dowries. They emphasized obedience, piety, silence. And sometimes, they rewrote her story. A woman with a visible difference might be described as devoted, serious, reserved. Traits that framed absence as virtue. Which is a pattern we'll see again. Now let's slide gently into Rome, where elite women were highly visible, highly scrutinized, and constantly compared. Roman matrons were expected to embody moral order. Their appearance reflected the household's discipline. A woman whose body appeared damaged threatened that image. So Roman elites used concealment aggressively. Jewelry wasn't decoration. It was strategy. Hairstyles hid scars. Clothing obscured asymmetry. Makeup masked illness. And when concealment failed, interpretation stepped in. Roman writers sometimes framed disfigured women as emotionally unstable, melancholic, excessive. Because if the body didn't conform, the mind must be suspect too. Which is convenient. One Roman noblewoman, whose name is lost but whose letters survive indirectly, was described as having a facial injury from childhood. Her family went to great lengths to keep her out of public rituals. She married. She had children. But she never appeared in formal portraits. She existed. But she did not represent. And representation mattered more than reality. Now let's slow things even further and talk about birth injuries, because childbirth was one of the most common sources of disfigurement for women. Ancient medicine was optimistic. Surviving childbirth often meant permanent physical changes. Tears. Scarring. Loss of mobility. Chronic pain. Visible effects that altered posture or gait. Elite women were expected to produce heirs. Quickly. Repeatedly. And when their bodies showed the cost of that labor, society did not reward them. It quietly replaced them. A woman who became visibly altered after childbirth might find herself less favored. Less present at court. Less consulted. Younger women stepped in. Not because she failed, but because her body reminded people of effort. And effort, for elite women, was not meant to be visible. Now let's float towards something even quieter, mental and neurological differences, which were often interpreted as physical disfigurement in ancient societies. Epilepsy, facial tics, speech impairments, tremors. All of these blurred the line between body and mind in ancient thinking. Women with these conditions were often treated as unstable, or dangerous, or sacred, or cursed, sometimes all at once. An elite woman with seizures, for example, might be kept secluded for her safety, which also conveniently protected the family's reputation. She might still marry, but her role would be minimized, her movements controlled, her public appearances carefully timed. And again, records would soften the language. She was frail, delicate, sensitive. Words that hide more than they reveal. Now let's gently acknowledge something else. Not all disfigured elite women were hidden. Some were used. In certain ancient courts, women with unusual appearances were treated as curiosities. Not mocked openly. Just displayed subtly. Included in gatherings where their presence sparked conversation. Which is a polite way of saying they became entertainment. This was more common in later Roman courts, but the roots existed earlier. Difference drew attention. Attention could be managed. For men, this sometimes led to patronage. For women, it rarely did. Because attention, for women, was risky. Now let's drift into ancient religious spaces, where things get paradoxical. Some disfigured women found protection in temples. Religious service could provide food, shelter, and purpose. But it also removed them from normal social life permanently. Once a woman entered temple service, leaving was difficult. Sometimes impossible. So religion offered safety. At the cost of autonomy. And these women often became invisible to secular history. Their lives documented only through inventories and ritual calendars. They were present, but silent. Which brings us to an important realization. Ancient societies did not universally abuse disfigured women. They structured life in a way that limited them. They didn't need cruelty. They had systems. Systems that quietly redirected women away from power, visibility, and choice. Now let's slow even more and talk about how these women aged. Elite women who began life visible but became disfigured later often experienced a gradual withdrawal. Less court presence. Fewer mentions. Portraits that stopped appearing. History didn't record a moment of removal. Just absence. Which is perhaps the most consistent theme here. Disfigured women did not vanish overnight. They faded. And fading is hard to notice unless you're looking for it. As we approach the end of this part, keep this thought gently in mind. Ancient societies were obsessed with order. Bodies that disrupted visual order were quietly managed, reinterpreted, or moved aside. Not always harshly. Not always kindly. But always deliberately. Hey guys. Tonight, we're doing one of those topics that sounds glamorous until you sit with it for more than about 5 seconds. So if you're already in bed, if the lights are low, if tomorrow can wait, perfect. Take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. Because tonight we're talking about what daily life actually looked like for women locked inside castles. Not the fantasy version. Not the sweeping gown running down staircases version. But the slow, repetitive, extremely indoor version. Castles, as it turns out, were less romantic fortress and more stone container for human routines. And women, especially noble and royal women, spent most of their lives inside them. Not dramatically imprisoned. Just expected to stay there. Because safety, and propriety, and control. Now, let's gently dismantle the idea that castle life was exciting. A medieval castle was cold. Even in summer. Stone holds temperature very well, and unfortunately that temperature was usually unpleasant. Fires helped, but not much. Smoke lingered. Drafts crept in through every crack. And privacy was mostly theoretical. For women living inside these walls, daily life began early. Not because they wanted to be productive, but because castles woke up whether you liked it or not. Servants moving. Animals making noise. Bells ringing. Someone shouting instructions in a corridor. Sleeping late was not really an option. So morning started with dressing. Which sounds simple until you remember that noble clothing involved layers. And laces. And pins. And sometimes help. A lady-in-waiting or servant assisted, not just for convenience, but because clothing was a social signal. How you appeared mattered. Even if no one important was coming. Once dressed, women usually attended prayers. Religion structured the day. It gave time shape. And for many women, it was one of the few sanctioned moments of quiet reflection. Then came the long stretch of hours that history rarely describes in detail. Because they were repetitive. And not very heroic. Women oversaw household management. This did not mean cleaning floors. It meant supervising. Making sure food was prepared. Supplies accounted for. Linen managed. Servants behaving. Which sounds dull. Because it often was. But it was also power. Quiet power. A noble woman might control an entire domestic economy within the castle. She decided who ate what. Who worked where. Who was disciplined. Who was trusted. Still, this power stayed indoors. And that's the key thing to remember. Castle women lived lives that were contained. They could move within walls. Sometimes between towers. Occasionally into courtyards. But leaving the castle required permission. Escorts. Reasons. Men traveled. Women stayed. Now let's slow things down and talk about space. Because castles were crowded. Despite their size, women did not usually have private rooms. Even queens shared spaces with attendants. Bedchambers were multi-purpose rooms. Sleeping, sewing, receiving visitors, sometimes even dining. So solitude was rare, which meant emotional life was always public. Grief, boredom, frustration. Everything was witnessed. And witnessed emotions became managed. Women learned to be composed, quiet, predictable. Because unpredictability drew attention. And attention brought control. Now let's drift toward the middle of the day, when time stretched the longest. Afternoons were filled with tasks meant to occupy hands and minds. Sewing, embroidery, weaving. Not hobbies. Expectations. Textile work was one of the primary ways noble women demonstrated virtue. Productive hands meant a disciplined mind. Even queens embroidered. Sometimes obsessively. Not because they loved it, but because idleness was suspicious. And so hours passed. Stitch after stitch. Conversations murmured. News exchanged quietly. Gossip filtered in from servants who heard things. This was how women learned what was happening beyond the walls. Because they rarely saw it. Now let's talk about education, because this is often misunderstood. Noble women were educated. Just selectively. They learned to read. Sometimes write. Often multiple languages, especially in royal households. They learned music, religious texts, courtly manners. But they did not learn governance, or warfare, or law, unless absolutely necessary. Knowledge was allowed, as long as it did not lead outward. So educated women lived with an awareness of the world they could not fully enter. Which does something to a person. Now let's gently shift to food, because food was both abundant and monotonous. Castle meals were heavy. Bread, meat, stews, ale, wine. Fresh vegetables were seasonal. Fruit was limited. Spices were status symbols. Women ate what was provided. Sometimes separately from men. Sometimes after. Eating was social. Observed. Commented on. A woman who ate too little was frail. Too much, and she lacked restraint. There was always a correct amount. And someone was always watching. Now let's float over to the emotional center of castle life, waiting. Women waited a lot. They waited for husbands who were away at war or court. They waited for letters. They waited for pregnancies to begin. They waited for pregnancies to end safely. They waited for children to grow. They waited for news. And waiting filled days. Castles were designed to protect against attack, not boredom. So women created routines, rituals, schedules, anything to give shape to time. But even with structure, monotony crept in. Which brings us to a quiet truth. Many women inside castles were deeply bored. And boredom, when combined with lack of autonomy, leads to strange coping mechanisms. Some women became intensely religious. Some obsessed over order. Some micromanaged servants. Some formed intense emotional bonds with attendants. Some retreated inward. And history labeled these behaviors differently depending on outcome. Pious, difficult, cold, devoted, rarely human. Now let's drift toward evening, when the castle slowed again. Dinner was earlier than we'd expect. Candles were expensive. Light mattered. After sunset, movement decreased. Conversations softened. Women gathered again. Sewing resumed. Stories were told. Songs were sung quietly. This was one of the few moments that could feel warm. And then bedtime. Which again, was rarely private. Women slept surrounded by others. Attendants nearby. Children sometimes in the same room. Fires banked low. And so the day ended. Then began again. Now let's pause gently and talk about freedom, because castles are often imagined as prisons. And that's not quite right. Women were not chained. They were not locked in dungeons. They were respected, provided for, protected. But protection came with boundaries. And boundaries shaped identity. A woman raised inside castles learned to think inward. Her world was contained. Her influence indirect. Her voice filtered. She mattered. But quietly. As we move forward in this story, we'll begin looking at specific women. Queens who spent decades inside stone walls. Noblewomen who never left the same castle where they were born. Women who adapted. And women who quietly unraveled. We'll talk about routines that never changed. Winters that felt endless. Marriages that brought new castles but not new freedoms. For now, just stay comfortable. Let the stone walls fade into the background. Let the pace stay slow. Because castle life was not dramatic most of the time. It was steady, contained, and very, very long.